Okay, so welcome to this workshop where we talk about the EU economics and regional power. The original goal of this workshop was to talk actually about the EU and regional power, so especially internally, how it resolves some of the issues it has, so what are the tensions within the EU. However, when making this workshop, I already noticed that just the economics part of itself is already deep enough to have a workshop on it to explain stuff, but it will still touch upon these tensions that happen within the EU. So I'm not going to talk in depth about the international relations that the EU has with other nations or other blocks of nations, but I'm going to talk to you about the economics of the EU, which is the main cornerstone. Because if you understand the economics of the EU, then you can understand most of the other integration that will be happening, uh, within the EU or that has happened within the EU. But before I start, like I said, I want to keep this quite interactive. I'm just going to ask you immediately a question. So, what are your associations with the EU? When I talk about the European Union and the EU, what do you think of? What do you already know? And this is a curiosity to have. So you can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat. Is anyone daring enough to unmute themselves to give an answer? I see in the chat, yeah, it's indeed a regional bloc. That's a good start. Can you maybe name a couple of examples of nations that are within the regional bloc? Or what the regional bloc roughly does? So the question is just the same as on the slide. So the question is just, what are your associations with the EU? So what do you know about the EU? Okay, it's facing a lot of threats right now. That's a good start. Can you maybe go to a bit more like specifics? So what you mean with threats? Yeah, Russia. It's an economic trade bloc comprising primarily of Nordic nations, France, Germany, etc. That's true. You will see a map. We'll see a lot of the map of Europe coming by, talk a lot about the nuances and differences. It's a free trade union where everyone follows the common currency. And of course, other threats are also talked about, just like Russia. There's a north-south divide and the China competition threat. All of these are all very true. Um, I'll talk a bit more about the news about the free trade and currency. Yeah, Middle East refugee crisis, still a very big thing within the EU. How are you going to deal with refugees? Energy crisis, also very true. Yeah, so you already got quite a lot of information going on. That's quite good. For now, I'll just move on. And what I'll talk to you about is kind of like just a couple of things. I'll just give you first an overview of the EU, just so we have a clear definition of it. And I'll talk about the single market, and then I'll talk a bit about fiscal policy. And if we have some time left, I'll talk about law. But I know also you're in a completely different time zone. I think for you, quite now, it's quite at night. So I'm not gonna keep it too long. We're gonna keep the law part contained if it's going to be already enough to talk about the other aspects. So what's the EU? So this is the map of Europe where you can see the EU nations. So as you can see, someone said there's like, especially like Western and Nordic countries. It's kind of true. So you have a lot of like Western nations. So where you say where West and Eastern Europe is always a bit of a semantic and also somewhat of a subjective discussion, even within Europe. But the generic Western European countries would be the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, France. They have quite a lot of Eastern European nations. So you have Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, uh, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, and Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. And they're also candidate countries. So these are people who are not, or countries who are not yet part of the EU, but who are trying to get there. So these are like Ukraine, Turkey, um, Moldova, Serbia, Bosnia. And of course, there's also southern European countries you have like Spain and Portugal and Italy and Greece. And Cyprus, of course, and Malta. So these are like smaller countries. And as you can see, it's quite a big group. So there are very different kind of nations. Um, Most importantly, the United Kingdom has left the EU. I hope that you've also heard a bit about this. It was a very big schism. Basically, it is that the United Kingdom was basically there was conservative people within the Conservative Party who didn't like the EU. They basically campaigned. Then what happened was that Britain held a referendum, and you are like, you know what, we're going to stamp out this thing is not going to get a majority. But then they never really campaigned in favor of the EU. So the conservative part of the conservatives that actually want to stay in the EU never really campaigned hard. And then in the end, the majority left, and it's actually been quite bad for for the UK because it's joining off the progress from the EU again, but for a higher price, so it doesn't have the benefits, but more of the costs. Um, so that's part of it. Someone in the chat asked why is Switzerland not in like here? Because it's not in the EU. It is part of the trade of like of trade union. We'll talk about that a bit later, but it's actually not part of the EU. Same with Norway, and that is same with Belarus, and they're also not candidate nations. They kind of don't want to for various reasons. Economically, they're doing well. They don't want to give up their sovereignty, all of that kind of stuff. But they still are part of other things. That still means that they get trade. So that's why they're grayed out. That really answers that question. And again, by the way, if you have any questions, do please ask them because in the chat or just unmute yourself so I can just get to the information as quickly as I can. Now I want you to think about this. Why is it that there are other nations here that have been candidate nations already for a bit? So think about Bosnia, Serbia, uh, Moldova. Why are these candidate nations that aren't part of the EU yet? So wait for people to type in the chat. Why is it that the nations in green are candidate countries and not yet EU member states? So Euroscepticism is definitely part of it, but there are also nations. Yeah, it requires a lot of compliance. Someone already said in the chat. So before you to become part of the EU, there requires for you to join, which basically means that you get good law and order. Because what you don't want is you want to have a country that becomes part of the EU that suddenly says, you know what, I'm not going to take part of the EU laws. I'm not going to take part of the regulation. I'm actually going to cancel that. I'm going to put in laws that actually aren't allowed by the EU. I'm going to be a pain in the ass in parliaments and all that kind of stuff. You don't want to have that. So you have requirements for anti-corruption, democracy, transparency, all that kind of stuff. So here are the reasons why they're waiting. Some of these nations, sometimes there's also Euroscepticism. So, for example, within Serbia, I think there's a genuine question whether or not the country would still actually want to join the EU, whether the majority of people who want to vote for would want to do it, or stay more pro-Russia aligned. But there's just a lot of issues with democratic stability. Oftentimes you also need like very good anti-corruption. So, for example, that's what's stopping Albania and also like Bosnia, because like it's politically not very stable. There are still issues with corruption. There's not a lot of media freedom, all these things that you want, and also well-defined borders. So one of the big reasons why Serbia is most likely going to join the EU soon is because Serbia still sees Kosovo as part of its own nation, whereas Kosovo sees itself as an independent nation. And therefore, Serbia joining the EU would need to give up Kosovo and the claim on Kosovo. And that's also why Kosovo is a potential candidate, but not an EU candidate country, because it just doesn't have a defined border. Like it's a lot of murkiness in international law what the position is of Kosovo, especially with respect to Serbia. Also, of course, Ukraine's in a war. You don't have very well defined borders if you are in a war. So it's just a lot of issues that might rise up. And it also shows you kind of like what the requirements are of the EU and why it's so stringent. And that is basically just the main idea of the EU when it comes to the nations. We'll see this map come by more often in various forms. So don't feel like you have to remember everything on every nation. At the end, you think you should get a good grasp of at least Europe or at least the regions. So then now we're going to get to more of the technical side of it, which is how do you make decision? And here it already gets a bit complicated. And it shows you immediately like the strength and the weakness of the EU. So there are roughly three important things that you need to know. So like you have the European Parliament, and basically, at some point, every EU citizen gets to vote for someone that they want to represent them in the European Parliament. This is just direct democracy. This is just how a normal parliament would work. Then you have the European Council, which is the heads of state or government. So it could be, for example, like a prime minister or something like that. And you also have the Council of the European Union, which definitely isn't confusing what the exact difference is. But here you have oftentimes people who are more more like technical. So first, these are government ministers. So these are issues around nature or like ecology. Or then you have the Council of the European Union. You have people who represent each nation there. So like you have so from each country you have one person, but who's specialized in that. So it could be like a minister or someone like that. So that's the main idea, that you have someone who is specialized in a specific field. And then you have the European Commission. And here it is one of those things where you have also commissioners, and each EU country sends one of them. And then the thing is one of those things where the European Commission submits legislative proposals. So they're like, okay, let's just, I don't know, ban AI within the EU. That could be an example. Then, at some point, both the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament need to vote on this policy. Maybe the European Parliament says, you know what, actually, I think it's a good idea. And then the Council of the European Union says, actually, we don't think it's a good idea. It's really bad for these new reasons. And then it goes back to the drawing board. And I think this shows you that EU regulations are very much discussed a lot. And there's also a lot of checks and balances. Because the idea is that you have both kind of like this majoritarian view that's represented, because you have a European Parliament, you have direct voting power here. So the majority of people within Europe find it specifically important. The European Parliament will vote that way. But also you still have regional like representation, like for federalism, because these countries can still also send one person and they're going to go to like the European Commission. So this is how you balance out the helping most people of the EU as well as helping the most countries in the EU. This means that getting legislation is really hard to do sometimes because you just don't get this agreement. It also means that when you're talking about the EU, it's quite complex. For a lot of people, I think they understand and grasp the basic concept of the EU, but the specific details, which one commission does, why they're doing it, what is like the most important aspects of these different bodies, they don't know. Like still, I get confused between the European Council and the Council of the European Union because they just sound so very, very similar. So it shows you both a strength of the EU and a weakness of the EU. That is why when it gets policy, you want to have that policy stay, because otherwise you've done all the effort for nothing. And it also means that in general, when you have policy, it has such a broad, support that is pretty sure it's going to be standing along well. That's at least the idea of the European policymaking. Now, I'm not going to go too much into all these details because there's a lot of other things we could talk about. So there is lobbying, of course, of very big companies within these different places. They're also much further removed from most people. So there's a question of like, not necessarily corruption, but the influence companies and like think tanks can have when they propose legislation and write up discussions and write up legislation that they want the EU to pass. Also like how much transparency there is, how much accountability, all of these kinds of things. And of course, the further you remove from it, the less people feel like they're doing something good. So it just becomes a question of you don't see the government, it's not very visible. So you don't really support as much. That's why people don't say that they identify as European or as a member of the EU, but rather still as Dutch or Belgian or Italian. Because yes, it implements stuff, but it's still very far away from the most people. I hope this is clear. And now we're going to get more into the economics of the EU. So let's talk about the single market. And I think this is where people were maybe confused why it is that Switzerland is not part of it. It is basically a single market is basically the idea that within this region, there are no taxes or tariffs or quotas on trade that are internally. So if I have a company here in the Netherlands, which is quite based, and I want to export to Spain, I can just send a truck all the way from the Netherlands to Spain. And I don't have to worry about any border controls. There are no border controls within the countries. There's no tariffs they have to pay to actually get this. And there's no quotas on trade. So Spain can be, you know what? You know what we hate? We hate the Dutch sending stroopwafels, which are cookies, towards Spain. We're going to set a limit on how much cookies the Netherlands can transport towards Spain. This cannot happen. So this is quite good for economic efficiency. Because it just allows companies to shift where it's necessary, makes it easier for them to, if they, for example, have a car manufactory in Germany, which actually is true, and they have another place in Eastern Europe, which maybe has steel manufacturers, then your supply chain just goes within Europe and there isn't any cost to actually get that transport here, except for the cost of, getting a truck and a trucker to travel all the way. Like you don't have to worry about tariffs. There's quite consistency. You don't have to worry about suddenly Croatia, for example, setting in a tariff and making it more expensive for you. So it creates trust, creates ease of flow, um, and it just makes a lot of trade easier. It also means that you have shared tariffs externally. And I think this makes sense, right? So let's say the Netherlands would want to put a very high tariff on the UK. Let's say we're mad at the UK because, I don't know, they are selling too many crumpets, another kind of cookie. And we're like, you know what? We're going to put a 20% tariff on crumpets, which means that for you it will be more expensive to actually get the crumpets towards Netherlands, which means our own cookies will actually become competitive. Well, let's say the UK actually could trade with France, and they could do and they could still trade freely. Like there's no quotas here. Then they could just go to France, export here, and then someone from France could resell it to the Netherlands, which means that this tariff that you've put on the UK does nothing. Like the crumpets will still flow into your country, no matter how many quotas and like tariffs you want to put in, because you can't put any tariffs on France. So this also means that when you're talking about having a tariff war, it means that every single country in the EU is also is also affected by this. And that's important when it comes to the US, but also of course China, because China is investing a lot in specifically Eastern European nations, which means that if you put tariffs against China, specifically these nations are harmed more than these other nations. And it is not possible for the Netherlands to be like, you know what, we're going to put tariffs on China just by ourselves. It has to be done together as one block. Another thing, as I said, like people, goods, services can freely move. Um, there is a nuance here because there's a difference between like a single market and like the Schengen zone where you don't need any visas and all that kind of stuff. All of that doesn't really matter in the grand picture of things. But if you do see a difference here of on what you see online, that is why I'm simplifying the picture a bit here to get you the main idea. It's just if I am Dutch and I want to work in Belgium, I can do that. If I want to live here in general, I can do that. It's like it's a free movement that we have. Okay. What else do we then have is you also have the same requirements and regulations. And here it again follows the same logic that you have for the having shared tariffs externally. If the Netherlands would set very high standards for food quality, but there's free trade of food, like you can't protect the food. You can't say no, for example, for France, to be like, actually, your cookies that you're making, they are the Madeleines, the French cookies, they're not very good. We want them to be healthier. They need to have less sugar in them. Like that can't because that would be putting basically rules or regulations or some kind of like from tariffs or punishment if they don't do it. You can do that because it's free trade. So everyone in the EU shares the same kind of regulations. This also means that externally, there's the same thing. So if the US wants to, I don't know, sell American cookies within the EU, and they also are very, very unhealthy, but we have EU regulation, it just means that the EU also, all of these nations will say, well, you can't do it because it's not healthy enough. It's too much sugar. Fun fact, the EU at some point also had not allowed Apple to basically not use a USB-C charger. Because you know Apple had like every single time they had a different charger, and they basically just used the same excuse about like but do we need it for the battery and all of this and that. It was basically kind of bullshit because you could just if you're Apple, you could just engineer to follow USB-C, but they just want to sell new chargers and new like plugs every year. So the EU was like in the end, no, you cannot do that. And because the EU is such a big market, when this legislation happened, in the end led to Apple changing their design for the whole world because they were like, you know what? If we have to do it for the EU, there's already so much. At that point, we can just standardize it. That's kind of the best thing that we can do. Um, so this also shows one of the benefits, which is it is one big market. So if you have a good trade with the EU, you can trade with every nation, and it's not possible for you to have internally like trade with one nation, not the other. You can trade with Finland and then not with France because of that single market, which means that the EU standards and quality is actually something that upholds oftentimes worldwide, but also means that there are big pushes that are happening. So, for example, there are right to repair laws. So, again, going back to Apple, because Apple's kind of like just a shitty company. At some point, they had like MacBooks. They had like the screens were so very tight, which meant that if one of the things broke, you basically had to get a new one because they had everything very, very compact. Under a right to repair law, that would not be allowed because you say, well, look, if you need to be able to repair it because otherwise it would be too much waste and would be not friendly to the people who are buying these products and we need to buy it again when it can be repaired. It kind of like protects people and protects them from very big companies, which is why it is quite good. It also means, though, that you have a lot of regulations. It's one of the things that Brexit was about, which is if you trade within the EU, there are a lot of regulations that you have to apply with. So these are safety standards, these are like health standards, these are like labor standards, all of this kind of stuff. And overall, that is bad if you're exporting to other nations. So the UK, for example, to give you another like to get with the example, they trade a lot within the EU. So if they want to export something to the EU, they still have to follow those regulations. But now, if they want to export to the US or to other countries in the Commonwealth, so maybe Australia or New Zealand, then they don't have to follow the EU regulations because, it's trade between other nations, so that doesn't matter. So that's kind of like, again, showing you what the cost benefit analysis might be here. And then I want to now ask you, like, what are the positive and negatives that you see in the system? I've already mentioned a couple of them. But what would be like the positives of the European single market? What would be the negatives of it? So lower supply chain cost, that's true. Trade just becomes easier. Trade's good. Companies make more profits, more people get jobs, less money just goes to nothing, and you get more competition, for example. Negative is a contagion effect during crisis like the Eurozone. That's actually true. We're gonna get that about the Eurozone, but it's basically if, I don't know, Italy just completely collapses, their economy just stagnates and like it just completely implodes on itself. Every other nation has traded so much with Italy and they're so dependent on Italy. Maybe they're buying Italian cookies or Italian pizzas. Then that means that that is basically just ruined. As also a small country get hurt more if you overregulate trends like AI or put on cheap import like China or put tariffs on cheap import like China. That's true. So indeed, some nations, especially Eastern European, which are tend to be more of the poor regions, because they basically got really fucked over during the Cold War because they were part of the USSR, which has economically destroyed them in a lot of ways. A lot of these nations were are not quite well off, and they would, for example, benefit from cheap import from China. And there's of course a very classic way of which is you have cheap imports, but there are also costs that come there. So dependence on China, the quality of the products. So if you know, for example, Shein or Temu, the clothes that you actually can buy there, they're actually poisonous, like they could cause cancer, because they just have way too much toxic chemicals that are not allowed within, normal safety regulations. But also there's also often other standard issues. So for example, Serbia had an issue where one of the train stations was actually built by a Chinese contractor. And there was basically a lot of issues with corruption, the lack of regulations, and all that kind of stuff. And the standards and quality was so bad that that train station basically collapsed. And that was a really big deal in Serbia. And it basically started the whole student protests that are happening right now in Serbia. So there's another example of like the quality debate that you can have there. Also, another negative is a moral hazard that Germany would just save us even if we mess up. Yeah, that gets to another thing, which is Greece, for example, might spend a lot of money, might lie about how much money they're spending. And at that point, if you always feel like Germany, because the economy is so important and all of these are so entangled, that Germany will always pull you out, then that just means that other nations have less interest in following the rules and are more willing to find the edge on how far they can really get. That's good. That's already a lot of the benefits and negatives that you have from the single market. And also, again, just to clarify, so Iceland and Norway and Switzerland are not part of the EU, but they are part of the single market, and for that they pay a lot of money. So they pay a lot of money to be part of the single market. Um, and that is also Liechtenstein, which is a very small nation, by the way. And that's basically a very important thing. There's also technically a difference between like a free trade union and like a shared monetary market, and then also like a single market. If you again see online nuances about this, which country is part of that, know that it exists, and there's nuances here in which sectors are affected, what aspects of the single market you have. So, for example, if you have shared tariffs or not. But All of that is more nuanced and doesn't really matter for, I think, the more large scope debates that you will have about the EU. But do note that the picture is a bit more gray than I'm painting it here when it comes to economic uh, engagement and what do I say? It's uniformity within the EU. Okay, so now what we're going to talk about is more about the budget. So this is kind of like the fiscal policy. And the idea is that the EU budget is long term. So if you look at the budget that we're currently living in, it's like 2021 to 2027. That's 6 year for a budget. The idea is basically spending, and it's a lot of money. So the current budget is 1,074 and 0.3 billion euros. That's a lot of money. And the revenue is basically split up in the following way. The most of it is just contributions from the countries. So there are nations who just pay a specific contribution towards the EU, basically saying, look, you're all these programs, we're going to pay us like a membership fee in that sense. Majority of the money comes from there. Then they, of course, like I said, they have this shared tariffs or duties on imports. So they say, you know what? We're going to protect our agriculture. So we're going to make it more expensive to import agriculture from outside. So guess what? You need to pay tariffs on that. And the tariff money directly goes to the EU. That's roughly 50%. And then they also just have a shared tax base, which basically just means that there's like minimum VAT taxes that are within the EU. And part of that also goes to the EU. Basically, you don't want to have too much competition on taxes. You want to be a way to kind of like fund the EU programs. And that is why it's introduced. But the majority of the money comes from these contributions. Now, what do you then spend this on, right? So you get all this money in. How do you spend it? Most of it's actually agricultural funds. So these are things like protecting agriculture, spending funds for farmers, for expansion, making it cheaper to produce, all of that kind of stuff. Then 30% is regional development. And if I say regional development, what would you think of? I'm asking a question, so I've been waiting for the chat, by the way. So what do you think of when it comes to regional development? Yeah, so it is basically oftentimes infrastructure and economic development. So things like food and water and that kind of stuff tends to not go as much because oftentimes most of the countries can already do it. It's more about large scale projects. So these might be building highways, building universities, basically doing economic development that way. And the other part is just the EU programs. So there are a lot of things that we have. So there's an Erasmus program, which basically means that European students can, for example, easily apply at a European university, even if it's not from the nation. So let's say you are from Romania and you want to actually go towards the Netherlands with the Erasmus program. It kind of like funds your ability to go there. Doesn't mean it's free, but it just means it's cheaper for you as a student. Like you can't discriminate based on it. So in the Netherlands, for example, it costs 2,000 euros to study for 1 year. Romanians would have to pay the same under the Erasmus program, but externally, so let's say you're maybe from the UK or you're maybe from the US, you would have to pay 10,000 euros per year. Basically, because you're not getting this funding, you're not getting help from university, you need to spend more. That is the basic idea. Those are other things. There's culture funds, so that's for arts programs, museums, all that kind of stuff. Research programs. Um, these are things also for new technologies, so maybe some green tech or maybe for pharmaceutical that you want to fund. And then also administration of the EU, which is a very, very small percentage. I think it's like max 5% of the full budget. And that's basically because, yeah, you just have a lot of like politicians there, you have like people doing a lot of bureaucracy around the EU, checking things, verifying, of course, the countries are upholding the standards. They are part of like, they're upholding the judicial system and the rules that we've made about them, all that kind of stuff. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If you have this characterization, right? So we have the EU, and let's just say there are a couple of blocks. So you have Western Europe, we'll do like Ireland, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany. You have the Nordic countries, so like you have Denmark, Sweden, Finland. Then you have the Eastern European countries, which you could say are these nations, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, maybe even Austria. And then you have like the Balkan Asian nations, which are Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Greece, and then you have the southern countries, which are like Italy, Spain, and Portugal. If I talk about these four different blocks, where do you think most of the money towards agriculture would go to? Remember, 40%, pretty big part of the budget, almost one third. To what kind of nations would they go to? Okay, so Spain and Eastern Europe. Does everyone agree with this? Does everyone have the same intuition? The ones marked red, that's also good. On the map, you see here net contributors and net takers. So it's indeed like Eastern Europe, Balkan Europe, well, Balkanish, because you have this whole region that you can't count in. And then Southern Europe, maybe Spain, Italy, not there. Interestingly, if you look at it here, so if you look at the funds, a lot of the nations that actually get them are not actually necessarily Eastern European or Southern European as you'd expect. So you see France gets a lot. Germany also gets actually quite a lot. And there are Eastern European nations who actually don't get that much compared to the rest. Like they get money, right? So here you have Estonia and Lithuania who actually don't get that much funding. Croatia doesn't get as much funding, especially compared to maybe even Spain and Germany. And I think the reason that you would have to get here is these are oftentimes different kind of economies, right? These are already quite big economies, which means that also they have very big agricultural industries. So, for example, the Netherlands, I'm from the Netherlands, that's why I always keep talking about the Netherlands, has a pretty big production of livestock. So these are cows, animals, and that kind of stuff. But also we have a lot of like greenhouses. And the same applies basically where we get a lot of the money because it's just more expensive for us to keep it in the first place, but also just about power. It's also about Germany and France has a huge rural population. That also like comes off protests, and because basically they want to appease them, these countries also want to have these funds because they want to stay competitive, right? Because wages are very expensive here, and because these projects are larger, you also need more funding for them to be competitive within the market. So that is why it basically means that quite a lot of the funding actually goes to nations which are already rich, which might be different. Because if you look at the previous one, you can see indeed that there are net contributors, which are also France and Germany, but they also get a lot of that money back in agricultural funds. And that shows you kind of like the nuance of the EU. It's not just rich nations give a lot of money and it all goes towards the poorer countries. It means that a lot of the money actually also in various ways flows back to these rich countries. Now, if you look right to the map, you still see there are countries here in red. These are Eastern Balkan countries, Portugal, Spain. And basically the reason for this is a lot of the regional development funds go here. Again, the intuition here is USSR was pretty bad for these nations. A large part of the industries got basically not necessarily even destroyed, but a lot of them became dependent on Russia. A lot of them moved towards Russia. A lot of like really bad things happened there as well with starvation and not necessarily caring as much about these nations. So it kind of like meant that because of that and the very extractionary nature of Russia between the USSR, a lot of infrastructure is pretty bad. A lot of corruption happened there. There's a lack of economic growth, lack of like companies who have a base there and good supply lines and supply chains. And basically, this means that still suffering from that. And because that infrastructure isn't there, because that trust isn't there, because the political and legal framework isn't maybe as fully there, like it's part of the EU, right? So it's not really, really bad, but it's still a very different doing business in, let's say, Hungary than it is in the Netherlands or Luxembourg. It basically means that a lot of the money goes there for the infrastructure, for the developed economically. And again, this also, of course, benefits these other nations, right? If Romania just becomes better at producing, I don't know, Romania sausages, Germany can buy them for cheaper. And again, they are less dependent in the end on Germany. So there's a lot of interest here into play, and that's why it's always a bit more nuanced. Now, there's another issue that we have within the EU, and I think we already talked a bit about this. So we have a Green Deal, like we have climate change and new energies that we want to create. We have money that we kind of want to spend on defense. We want to have AI companies that we want to have like prop up and tech companies that we have in our own industry. We have huge farm subsidies that we have, but we also have a budget. And of course, what tends to happen with budget, even though there are nations who benefit, still quite some, the net contributors are always a pain in the ass about the budget. So the Netherlands and Germany, especially, and also actually Denmark, they'll actually be a pain in the ass during these budget discussions, and they'll say, you know, you said you wanted to spend all of this money, but we don't want to spend more money. So we should actually cut, for example, uh, the agricultural funds so that we can spend more on defense because they basically don't want to spend more. Now, the question is, what should the EU do to basically get more income? Basically to solve this budget issue. Common bonds, indeed, indeed. So what you would think is the EU is one of those institutions where the money in needs to equal the money out. If there is a slight discrepancy, right, there's a crisis, all this kind of stuff, then that means that countries will need to contribute more to basically plug that hole. But if you look at a country, this is not how they do their budget. How they do the budget is basically by saying, look, we're going to have money that we want to spend, but it's not as much as we get in. So what we're going to do is we're going to sell government bonds. And these are basically saying, you know what? We are a state, we're going to buy these bonds back, we're going to pay you back. This is just a loan. This is a common loan, but we're a big nation, we're a big country, we'll be very, very cheap because it's very, very likely for us to actually pay it off. So it's a very cheap way to borrow money. And that's how we're basically going to plug that hole. That's how we're going to spend more now to basically save, to basically do the things that we need to do. Be it defense, be it dealing with inflation or the corona crisis, the COVID crisis. So let's say we have common bonds. What would be the issue? So this means the EU as a whole just starts borrowing money and becomes part of the budget. They say, look, we have more money that we want to spend, but we can't get it from the income that we have right now, so we're going to create bonds. I'm going to give you another hint. Which nations most likely do not want actually covered bonds or EU bonds? Yeah, so the nations who already contribute significantly to the budget don't want euro bonds. Like the Netherlands and Germany, they don't want euro bonds. Denmark, neither. Yeah, and the basic idea for this is basically physical discipline, right? So the idea is that let's say it becomes possible for the EU to now create these bonds. Let's say next year they want to have another budget. Again, for many reasons, they feel like, China is getting to us. We need to make our exports cheaper. We need to invest more in like AI industries or electric vehicle industries. What then happens is the EU might be like, just this time again, we'll just create more bonds. And then the next time it happens again, it's like, yeah, but Greece is not doing well. We want to invest more in that place, so let's just get a bit more. And kind of like becomes like a heroin addict with bonds, where it's like just a bit more hit, just this one more economic, you know, injection, and we'll be able to actually get across. And then it becomes quite nuanced because then it becomes one of those things where you're basically borrowing money and it becomes more expensive, right? So if you need to pay interest, right? Because the people who buy these bonds, they're gonna be like, yes, sure, I'll give you 1,000 euros. I'm not gonna just want 1,000 euros just so that you just pay me 1,000 euros back. I want you to pay interest because maybe you default, or maybe you don't pay it as quickly, or maybe all that kind of stuff. I want to also spend the money. So you are paying more money in the end. And that is why nations maybe don't want to do this. You want to have fiscal responsibility. You want nations to actually be able to hold all of this together and not spend as much. And other things, of course, there are nations like fiscally disciplined ones, like the Netherlands and Germany, where we focus on trying not to spend too much money, where we try to basically don't have a budget deficit that's really, really high. If we now have European bonds, you now have competition because some investors might now, instead of going for the Dutch bonds, go for the European bonds because it's a bigger market. More countries are there. There's way more interest in buying these out and building this out. So of course you're going to maybe trust this more, and maybe also the interest rate's going to be maybe a bit more attractive. This means that then the bonds that you have from the Netherlands becomes more expensive, to become less highly valued, which means that the Netherlands has to put higher interest rates to make them more compelling, which means that other nations' own fiscal policy can get restrained by this. Because maybe they now need to plan like, look, we thought on like maybe creating 1,000 euros in bonds, but because of the fact that we're competing with the EU, we basically only do 900 euros in bonds because otherwise we have to pay too much and we don't want to do that. So it also is a way that it encroaches on fiscal policy of these nations. And fiscal policy, I just mean again, you have a budget, the state gets money in, the states want to spend money, so you get money out, and then this is just the fiscal policy of the nation. All of those things get affected. But of course, you do get the benefit, right? Because what would the benefit be of having a shared bond, like a common bond within the EU? Also, someone else came up with a different idea of why it actually might be bad to create these bonds, if I understand this comment directly. It is that you now have maybe inefficient programs, such as maybe the agriculture funds, which are maybe going not to the places you would want them. So what you want is maybe have less money there and then go to more efficient industries. So for example, green tech, uh, or other important things. So let me see. Yes, that would be, for example, one of the other aspects that you could do. I don't think that's necessarily what the comp is getting at, but there's another way that you could resolve actually the budget issue. What would be the benefit of getting euro bonds? Exactly. Like it's very easy. The money can be spent for important things, right? So it's projects like economic development. Some nations are not doing well. You can also do a lot of like things that are more long term that states individually might not have the incentive to invest in as much. So these are grandiose research projects that last years and years and years, way longer than any election campaign or like election result would last. These are things like things that just uniquely the EU can do. And again, the benefit of the EU is it kind of deals with what's basically just a kind of free rider problem. We basically now have a policy where you have money going in and it's kind of like forced to, or you have this project. Basically, everyone has to put in and everyone is benefiting from it. You also don't have the issue where the classic example is always like everyone needs a dam because there's going to be a sea outside. And if you don't have a dam, then you're going to drown. But everyone basically doesn't want to give money or effort towards the dam because they could spend that money and effort everywhere. And you're able to resolve this kind of like issue where you have clear regulations where everyone's own benefit doesn't work, but not doing anything is worse for everyone. So you just solve that specific issue. There's a tragedy of the commons also called. And I think these are the kind of things that you can also solve with budgets. So this might be large infrastructure projects, organizing as well. So if you leave, for example, between nations to discuss to create a train line, as let's say the Netherlands and Germany has had, we tried to create train lines. We had like multi-million dollar plans to do this. We spent it all. And then in the end, it happened that the train tracks were not aligned the same way. So it basically meant that we still had to have German coaches with Dutch coaches, and we had to transfer them along the border because the train tracks were just not the same. That would be, for example, another way where you could be, if you have a large project would be EU focused, all of these issues would be kind of like more easily resolved because you can standardize these things. You can take a big picture view instead of just maybe having countries being stubborn and being like, no, we don't want to adapt, or no, you don't want to adapt, because it's all coming from the same budget, the same plan. Another comment is if we can allow external investors to buy EU bonds, there can be a greater injection of funding due to trust within the EU stability and stable ROI, so return of investment, and wouldn't create inter-country dependence. So I assume that you mean that because the EU bonds just are so trusted, because it's a very big market, as we said, and there's a lot of interest of all these nations to actually build each other out and not do this in a very irresponsible way, you wouldn't get a lot of bonds being able to be held over the head. So if China buys a lot of EU bonds, then they wouldn't be able to be like, we're going to sell all of these off, or we really bad because these are already trusted. So the international market, they would still be trusted no matter what, even if China sells them off. I think that's what you mean, right? And that's also better because maybe that's true for the EU, but it's not true for Romania or true for Hungary, who maybe doesn't have as much trust in their specific projects. So definitely they will benefit. Whereas other nations, as Germany, might be harmed with their fiscal policy. Of course, you get things like maybe it's good, right? Richer countries maybe don't get as much rich, poorer countries get a bit better. But then the question becomes, where are specific industries like your more high-tech industries or your super competitive industries? Those are most likely in these West nations. They also will get affected by this. So it isn't just always as easy as just saying, the risk and richer, the poor get poorer. It's about what key strategic resources and industries do you have in which place, but also how these respond, right? So then as Germany might get pissed off, what does it mean? Maybe even harsh discussion for the next budget, or all of other ways that they might try to basically be a pain in the ass. Okay, that was basically the EU budget. Now, we're already taking quite some time because we're discussing everything in great depth, which I think is good because it shows that we're applying the context. But it does mean I think that the last thing we will discuss, especially also taking into account your time zone difference, is just the Eurozone. So, as you can see here, this is the Eurozone. So these are all the nations that share the euro. These are not all the nations within the EU. So there are some nations who have still their own currencies. For example, Poland has, I think, the Polish lev. You have the Danish crown in Denmark. Croatia has recently joined the euro. And it basically is one of those things where some countries still want to hold on to their specific currency. That's one thing. Or two, some countries are not fulfilling the requirement to be able to join the Eurozone because there are strict requirements on like how much money you spend, so fiscal policy. Again, like there are stricter regulations on like the monetary aspect of your country and like what your banks are also doing and applying to. Because instead of having your own central bank, you're giving it up because there's now a European central bank, and the European central bank now determines your interest rate for the countries locally. So that just all of those things are changed, and therefore also the banks need to follow specific regulations and rules to be able to work from the Eurozone. So not every EU nation has, or the EU nation has a euro as a currency. Some have their own currency, and sometimes this becomes even more complex. They have their currency pegged. And to peg a currency basically just means you say there's a stable rate between the euro and our currency. So you say 1 euro is always 7 Polish lev. And the idea is it makes the currency not float. It means that trade and currency exchange become easy and trustworthy, and you can build on that for the future. But it also just means that you need to spend money basically buying and selling currencies to be able to uphold that. Now, all of that's quite complex. We're going to leave pegging a currency for now, but it does also show that just because you're not part of the Eurozone, you're not like fully independent of the euro, given that sometimes they are already pegged and they are already dependent, therefore, on what the euro does in value. Uh-huh. Okay. There was a question about Brexit. We'll talk about that later after this. It'll be in a general question kind of format. So then the Eurozone. These are the nations that are in there. And before we get on, I'm basically going to give a basic explanations of currencies, just to make sure that we get this picture great. So in my great paint skills, I have created two nations. One is a green nation, which basically has dollars. They have a big sack of money. They want to buy this car from the blue nation, which has euros. The blue nation has cars, and the car costs 100 euros. Now, the way in which currencies are valued respectively to each other impacts how much you're going to export. Because let's say the currency exchange rate is $100, and for that you get 100 euros. That just means that this green guy can for $100 buy one car. That's great. Now let's say the currency exchange is such a way that the euro is very strong, which means there's a very high value. That means that just like $100 is not going to do. You're going to need to pay $150 to basically get these 100 euros. That means for this green guy, the cars becomes way more expensive because now it's instead of costing $100, it costs $150. So this means that the exports become less competitive and therefore you get less exports. Let's just go then for the next thing, which is if you look at the currencies and you look back in these nations, there are countries which are very export heavy and the countries which are import heavy. And the basic idea is, let's say these cars are really, really good. So a lot of people in the green country want to have them. This means that the demand for the euro goes up because a lot of people want to buy these cars. That means that if there's more demand for the euro becomes stronger, it becomes more expensive. You know, it's a very just simple price and demand, the way it works. This means that $150 will now be for the 100 euros. This means that this industry becomes less competitive. And similarly, if you have a country which actually has a very weak currency, so not a lot of countries actually want to buy it from them, that means that actually, even if their industries aren't that competitive, like they aren't that cheap, if you look at maybe the how to say this, based on like the purchasing power of like the currency within the country. So, you know, it's not like they're producing very, very cheap, like a car costs maybe €1,000 to make, but the currency is really, really cheap. Then the cars actually become more competitive than you would expect based on just how expensive it is to make there, because the currency is that cheap. So that means that some industries get harmed and some industries get benefited from having their currencies in a specific value. Now, why is this important for the EU? Well, if you know a bit about, you know, the story about currencies, this is a very classic example, but the EU, you have nations which have quite important industries that they want to export. So again, Germany wants to export their cars. That means normally like if you have a German crown or German mark as like currency, that would be very highly valued. But let's say you have countries which are quite weak in exporting, like Greece, who doesn't have much of an export industry. They are also part of the euro. That means that if you combine these currencies, then the value, like the demand for the euro, actually goes slightly down compared to the German mark, because it's basically combining with a weaker currency. That means for Germany, it becomes really, really nice because the export becomes cheaper. It goes now from this $150 to the $100 for 100 euros, which means they can export more. For Greece, it becomes worse because for them, these $100 now becomes $150 in this kind of way. So for Greece, it's kind of like bad because you would want them to have a cheap currency country. That means it's easier for tourists to go there because it's very cheap. You know, if $1 gets you like one cocktail, you're gonna be like, oh my God, that's so great. Like, I want to go to Greece. There's nice weather and very cheap food because the currency exchange is quite low. But that doesn't happen as much because as a consequence of being shared within Germany, they're basically harmed economically. It also means that when you have these Eurozone countries, the dependency goes up. So basically, you already have a lot of trade, And that's already a way to get this independence. There's already a shared budget, which creates off interdependence. But sharing a currency is really, really important because if a country now goes down and their budget completely fails, it completely tanks the trust in the currency because you don't know how much it's going to be worth. And that has both benefits and negatives. And I think we already got at this when we were talking about the single market. It means that when Greece is failing, it now will be built out. It will not be like Argentina where it basically will fail because it just doesn't have a nation that cares enough to completely build out. But it also means that countries like Germany and Spain and those other nations who are known for having quite a lot of spending fiscally don't have maybe as much interest in completely abiding by fiscal responsibility because they also will know that Germany will them out. Doesn't mean that they'll do it completely haphazardly, right? The EU, the Eurozone crisis was definitely traumatic for Greece and they're still struggling economically. But it also means that it's one of those things where it's like a kid, If you have a kid and you want to let them touch the stove, if it's really, really hot, they'll never touch the stove again. And you know for sure they'll be very, very disciplined fiscally. However, if the stove is lukewarm, they will only touch it again and again because, the first time they didn't get burnt. So it's one of those things where you could say Greece would definitely have been even more fiscally responsible if it would have been one of those things where they felt like Germany would not build them out or Germany will not build them out in the future. So you just have like the cost and benefits. Now there's a question that has been happening ever since the Eurozone crisis, which is should the EU adapt a northern and southern euro? So it's like two different currencies. So you'd have all of these nations, right? So let's maybe be nice. France, Austria, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Ireland, the Baltic states, and Finland. These are all together in one nation, and the southern ones is basically everyone else. So this would be Greece, Italy, Malta, Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, Croatia, Slovakia, Slovenia. All these nations would have, Czechia. All of these nations would have the southern euro. Would this actually be good? So again, the question is, why would it be overall good or bad to actually get a northern and southern currency? Okay, so southern currency would definitely be good for southern countries because they would still have uh, their currency not be valued up, so they can have more growth. And indeed, cheaper services, so people will still come in. That would be the positives. Of course, they would have the reverse effect, of course, for the northern euro, which would be quite bad for Germany because then their exports become even more expensive and therefore less competitive. So it's a trade-off. Which group of nations do you care about more? And what other aspects would be important if you would have a northern and southern currency? So you have diversification, so this stops contagion. So if Greece, for example, really fucks it up, then it doesn't affect Germany as much. It still does, as we talk about the single market and the EU budget, but it does less because of the currency. So there's less effect here, which means that the crisis is more contained. But wasn't also then the consequence of this? If it's more contained, there's less contagion. And the consequences also of less contagion is that you have less dependencies on each other, but also therefore less willingness maybe to build them out. And you have also maybe less trust in these institutions. So yes, maybe export might be higher, but again, maybe you don't trust the central bank of Southern Europe as much, which also has a lot of cost for whatever monetary policy they would want to implement, like institutionally, how this would look like with respect to banks and all that kind of stuff. So maybe the Southern European Central Bank would have to put in even stricter regulations and caps on banks to create more trust within this, and therefore that might also harm economic development. That would be one way. But also, again, you don't have as much pull together because you're small nations, which also means that you might not be able to help them as well. Maybe Germany says, well, look, you're your own Southern Euro, um, and therefore there would be issue a lot of like um what's it called? But I guess you've made your debt. We're not gonna bill you out. We're not gonna pay for all the issues that you've had because you had your own currency, so you have your own responsibility. With power comes responsibility, and you failed, so therefore not going to bill you out. And this is a question whether a discrepancy between the Northern and Southern Euro will create debt crises. Um, it kind of depends. As we said, like you have the EU budget, which also is of course different than the monetary policy because there are nations who are part of the EU, so who get benefits from fiscal policy of the EU, which is like we said, the agriculture funds and development funds and all this kind of stuff. And you have nations which are part of like the Eurozone, and they're having their currency based on that. And then if there are different values there, that might affect the way that you have the European budget work out, development-wise, income-wise, all that kind of stuff. And also, it might be a question of if you don't have an alignment on fiscal and monetary policy. So how are you going to put the interest rates within your banks compared to your fiscal policy? So maybe you're trying to, let's just say, stimulate the economy. So you want more growth, more investment. So you put in a lot of budget. Then monetarily, you're actually not going to put that much, not going to lower the interest rate to actually stimulate the economic growth. They're actually going to hire them. Then you get a discrepancy there. And it also might lead to economic issues where you basically don't have an alignment of your fiscal and monetary policies. Also, indeed, the trade becomes a bit harder, right? It's very nice that you have a euro that you can basically use when trucking from Croatia towards Germany to go steel from Croatia towards the steel manufacturer in Germany. But it's also one of those issues where it definitely means that economic integration will be less, but it's not one of those things which will create a crisis in of itself. Because as we already stated, there are different nations who are part of the EU who have a different currency, like Poland. So it's definitely one of those things where it's not the end of the world for EU, but it will be on the margin worse off economically, trade-wise. Okay, so my question now is, we're going to skip the part about law, because again, we've already been talking for, I think, more than an hour. So there was a question already. In the meantime, if you have more questions about the EU, put them in the chat. There was one question about Grexit, which I think means, or like Jerexit, like Germany exit, like what the issue is and why EU is fragmenting, with Germany also having disagreement with EU policies. So basically, one of the main issues with EU has basically been also like budget-wise. So it is, where do you spend your budget? How basically you want more money to come in for Germany and all that kind of stuff. That is one part. So it's like there's going to be budget, spending more, where it's going to develop more on like defense or more or like maybe helping their AI business or tech businesses grow. And then also there's another issue, which is there's anti-EU sentiment within these different nations. And I think the reason to basically look at this is the EU is very far away. So any kind of like issues that we have with economic inefficiency or allowing all these immigrants to come into our countries can be assigned to the EU. And every time that the EU does something like, I don't know, building infrastructure or doing something good trade-wise, oftentimes national governments take credit for it. Where they're like, look, all the good things we did, like we made sure we got the trade deal. Look, we are the reason why we got you like a university now in your city and all that kind of stuff. But all the bad things, that's the EU. So that's one part why you have large groups of people being anti-EU, but also again kind of like the free travel of people means that there is problems with immigration and refugees. So the problem is mainly that because there's free travel within the EU, it's very hard for example, Germany to basically say, well, look, we have all of these refugees coming in, we want to kick them out, and create like a consistent policy there. Because if they get in, for example, via Greece or Turkey, like, via Greece or via Italy or Malta, Cyprus, which oftentimes happens, then they can travel up north. And then there's an issue where maybe they kick them out or they kick them back, but there isn't always an easy way to actually get them kicked out of the EU. And that is one of the issues, which means that there are also a lot of like immigration issues that are linked and perceived to be linked with the EU, which means that if you have very big anti-immigration parties and anti-Muslim parties in Germany, there's AfD, they're also against the EU. There are also other reasons why they're against the EU, because the EU has anti-corruption policies and strict rules about democracy and how much like freedom like the press needs to have, which are also what these parties want. So there's always like a group of people who want to basically get separate from the EU as a consequence from that. So the economic policy of the EU, and I think you're talking here about the budget, basically goes through the same thing that I showed here, which is that the Commission basically suggests a budget and then gets voted on. So it is one of those things where the nations vote for it. I don't know the specific percentage. I don't know if it's like 50% or 60 or like 70% in the European Commission and also more than 50% in the European Parliament. I don't know those specific statistics, but I know it goes via this body. And then, of course, also the Council of the European Union or the European Council also have to have a say on it. And basically, it's one of those things where it is basically agreed upon. And then basically after that, it's kind of like it becomes matter of fact, right? So once it is voted in, you can't go away from it because otherwise it will mean nothing, right? If it's just a policy that you can just follow back from budget-wise, it doesn't work. And in these budgets, you also have things like money for defense, money for climate change, so green energy. You have money for like AI tech businesses, make them competitive. And similarly for this also goes, of course, for tariffs, goes a similar way via that method. There's also, when it comes to the Eurozone, is of course a bit different because the Eurozone, you have a central European bank and they determine a lot of things. So the European Central Bank basically collaborates with what used to be the national banks of these countries. So the Netherlands used to have their own national bank, which is called the Dutch bank. That Dutch bank does not create its own interest rates anymore. Like the banks in the Netherlands, like ING and Rabobank, I don't know if any of these names mean anything to you, but any of these banks, they get loans not from the national bank, but to the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank basically sets the monetary standard. But the European Central Bank also works with the Dutch National Bank to basically create oversight, right? So the Dutch National Bank still controls and like checks these Dutch banks. They're like, okay, so how much liquidity do you have? So how much money do you have in the bank that people just want, if they want to have cash, you can give them that cash. And you don't invest all the money, for example, that you still have some money solid, ready, able to be sold and be used whenever you need to. What are your transparency? What are you investing in? Like, are you like, they're doing like advisory stuff. And basically the Dutch National Bank still checks this and verifies this, and then goes back to the central bank, the European Central Bank, and then basically it gets discussed there. So maybe the European Central Bank says, look, we are very worried that people are like banks are investing too much in AI, and therefore they're being like they're creating loans which are not very smart and are very risky. And then it basically just leads to a cooperation with the Dutch National Bank and the European Central Bank. So in this sense, it's less like voted on, it's more technocratic, but that's true for any central bank that tends to be more technocratic. Has maybe sometimes people voted in, but like the central bank in Europe basically creates policy and this basically gets trickled down. And the reason again why you have the Dutch National Bank doing this is they are kind of like the people who know about this region, right? They've cooperated with these banks, they speak the language, they understand like the system. Like yes, the EU is unified, But of course, a bank that is in, I don't know, Greece has maybe a different work structure, maybe a different way of internet infrastructure, all this kind of stuff, like the way that they produce things or what kind of like is normal within the bank compared to the Netherlands or Belgium and all that kind of stuff. So then questions about where can we read more about the EU? So this is a very good question. So when it comes to the EU, uh, I've just basically been looking at a couple of sources for this workshop, which has been Wikipedia, which gives you just like the broad strokes of it. Then the European Union also oftentimes the different bodies have videos on YouTube where they actually explain what they're doing. It's sometimes very basic stuff, but it just does create some clarity. And then there are some YouTube sources I found useful, which is TLDR, which is too long didn't read, but like it's what it stands for. And they have like an site on the EU, like a YouTube like videos on the EU where they go into more detail, like what is this policy proposed, why are nations in favor or against it, and if you want more specific and want to keep up to date, that's the source that I would recommend. I've been reading some of The Economist as well. I would generally not recommend that because it's quite American based, and what tends to happen is there's quite some differences. They don't focus as much on the EU as like maybe one or two articles, as well as I disagree with some of the ways that they describe things. So they describe any left-leaning party in the EU as socialist, which is just factually wrong. But again, it's a very American way of looking at politics. So definitely, I would look at Too Long Didn't Read TLDR news. If you found, you can very easily find them. Um, a small query regarding EU legislature. Does all the member states need a unanimous consensus to pass laws? It's just a majority vote, with dissenting nations have to buy, especially with voting to add new nations or novel legislature and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to big decisions, it needs to kind of like be unanimous. So if it's, for example, a COVID relief plan or an issue that comes with the Ukraine war, it kind of like needs to be consensus, and it's also why it takes long. So it's one of those issues where the EU is one of those places where you can kind of like love it and hate it at the same time because you can love it because it can create a lot of good legislation, like the right to repair law, a lot of laws with respect to protecting nature and all that kind of stuff. But it also is incredibly slow, which means that, for example, discussions right now on defense are only happening for like the 2027 budget because that's when you have a new budget coming in. It also means that when it comes to like the AI tech firms, it's quite a hard discussion to have, and there's a lot of like nations needing to abide by it, and like need to agree with it. So it's one of those things where it definitely is slow, and therefore a bit sluggish. Are there more questions? So was it TLDR? I don't get that question. If the question is what is TLDR, it's the YouTube channel which talks a lot about news happening within the EU. Okay. When it comes to adding new nations, it actually does need to be completely in agreement. And that's why, for example, Macedonia has been a bit of a pain in the ass because there's like disagreements between nations like Bulgaria and like Greece about Macedonia and the name. Like they used to be called Macedonia, but then Greece was like, oh, actually, there's a province here that's also called Macedonia, so you should be called North Macedonia now. And then the Bulgarians actually were, well, Macedonia was actually part of Bulgaria, and this and that, and they're basically pain in the asses. So it's basically one of those things where it's just a bit of a pain in the ass to kind of like get them through. And it's like similar issues with some nations. Um, that is basically why it was always a bit more complicated there because you need everyone to agree. And then it's also like I said, I think it's the yeah, I think now that I remember, it's like more like qualified majority. So it's like I think more than 50%. I think something like 60% of parliament, and I think then the majority of the states. So it's like there are 27 EU nations. Then it means to be like 14 at least within the now you say it right, the European Commission. They agree with it. Are there any trademark restrictions on tech being shared and developed within the EU? Our nation's protectionist with regards to it. So IP and protection laws. That's a very good question. That is the specifics that I would not know of currently. I assume being the EU, my intuition would be there will be rules and of course protections of patents. And I don't think that there is sharing with patents. So if, for example, you have a pharmaceutical company within Denmark and they would have like a patent on, I don't know, like diabetes treatment. Like it's not like a German company. We just have access to that like information just because they are in Germany. This also works because you can still have other countries who have subsidiaries within Germany, right? So there are Chinese companies who still have their own subsidiaries or investments in Germany. So if there would be the sharing of IP laws, any company coming from the outside would still be able to exit. But similarly, also this Germany company has assets in China. So like if you would share their data information, then it might be that internally it get leaks to China and all that kind of stuff. So I think it would be just too much of a actual protection hazard to say there's any sharing of IP laws or that kind of stuff. And it's just that you have protections of one company being able to hold the patents and trademark on that. Uh, so I think that's kind of like trademark restrictions, and I think that just kind of like depends on the specific sector and company. So I know, for example, the Netherlands has a very big, not chip manufacturing, but manufacturer of what was it called? Chip manufacturing machines. So instead of actually making chips, we make the machines that make the chips. And it's basically ASML. It's the only company who does it because there's a huge amount of physics involved. And of course, me having studied physics, I love this shit. And basically, there's a lot of protection and secrecy that's happening there. So it is like if you're doing research there for like a bachelor or master projects with ASML, there are like non-disclosure agreements that you have to sign because they don't want all of this information to be out in the public to mean that China or Taiwan or any other nation will be able to make these machines anyways because they basically have a monopoly on this industry. Like they're the only ones who make the machines that make chips. And that is a huge amount of money because it's important for AI, it's important for electric vehicles and for chips because they all need chips, and that's basically a really important company within the Netherlands. So there's a lot of like protectionism there, but part of it's also like just what the companies apply to, right? So the companies just apply all of these like trademark restrictions. They apply for them, and I think there's more likely will be with a European court system, given that there is a European level legislation that's happening and oversight of justice as well. So that's a bit more spec about the Dutch economy. Are there any more questions? Any last questions? So if I have a book on EU economics, I would recommend. Um, I would if I've ever read the EU economics book. I've read quite some. None of them. The main issue is that everything is always changing. So after the Eurozone crisis and after like the 2008 crisis, there were a lot of like legislations that were put in place within the EU. And then there was a new Green Deal that was created. And these are all like very different aspects of the economy that the best way I would just recommend getting through them is just going just to the Wikipedia, just looking up what these things are. and then just doing cross-reference on sites and that kind of stuff. Because it's very hard to have one book which explains all of these things that are constantly changing, but also doing it in the right level. Because as a debater, you are asking for something specific. You're not asking for a story, which oftentimes happens with accessible non-fiction books about the economy, where there's a story and basic explanation and all of this kind of stuff. And you don't want to have like an academic book because or academic journal because it uses way too much econ jargon that is just unreadable. So the line that you want to walk is quite hard. So I would in general recommend don't like that there hasn't been a book that I've read about the EU economics that actually works. Just do the online research where you branch off and find sites. In general, if you have basic economic concepts that you find hard to understand, Investopedia oftentimes have a lot of the terms explained, a lot of intuitive examples that they give. So that would be a good way if you try to expand your knowledge in that sense. And if you want more about EU specific economics, most of it will also come by with the TLDR News EU YouTube channel. Because they will give the context of okay, there's change in the budget, but how is the budget made up? Like they'll explain that in their video. So they'll make sure that you have everything that you get, and then they will also name anything that you might want to know of, and then you can look that up yourself. Does EU have military development policies? So it doesn't have a shared EU army, which is why there have been motions about this. It has border protection force, which basically is just we don't want illegal refugees and immigrants to come in. Well, there are no illegal refugees, so it's only illegal immigrants to come in. So you have a border force that basically tries to like kick them out. That's the idea, not allow them to go in, and to protect the borders. That is something that the EU has funded, but it doesn't have like a standing army. Uh, I think there are maybe some EU military cooperations that exist. So I thought there was something within Somalian pirates and basically the protection of EU ships. Um, I am not 100% sure for that, but I do know it's not necessarily one of those things where we have in, for example, Africa or the Middle East or anywhere like an EU standing army or that kind of stuff, because they're just different nations want different things, and there's no money allocated for the budget for such operations to such a large extent that I am very aware of them. So this is definitely one of those points where you could look it up yourself a bit. That's what I would definitely recommend because I do not know from the top of my head in any reliable way what these smaller actions would be. Okay, great. I'll just assume for now that these are all the questions. If there are any more questions that you have, you can of course ask me. You can contact me on Messenger. I'm very easily found. The session is recorded. It will be shared with you. I think I will send you where it will be accessible on your YouTube version, but you can also just look up Dutch Competitive Platform on YouTube, and then you'll find this workshop as well, because I will upload it when it gets rendered.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I am Oli from Dhaka. Actually, I have joined very lately, actually. So I have a question that is, what is the purpose of the program of today?
Okay, so the purpose is basically for you to get an understanding of what is happening within the EU economically. So the main focus today was on EU. Yeah, we're gonna go. Actually, you're not seeing the screen, so you're not seeing me scroll past the slides. But it basically was about EU economics and regional power. So it's about how does the EU actually shape its economic policy, which is the common Eurozone, in which some countries of the EU are part of, is single market, which is basically the free trade that exists between all EU nations, as well as some other non-EU nations. And then also how do they basically fiscally deal with any issues that they have. So where do they get the money from? Where do they spend it on? And then with all of that, a flavor of regional power. So which nations benefit, who is against a certain policy, Why are they against it? Who gets benefit by what? Who gets negatively affected by what? And that was basically the goal of the workshop.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for briefing. Actually, I have a MBA on marketing. So can you tell me the knowledge of this topic? How the knowledge from European Union economics can help me?
As someone who's done like marketing, you mean? Or you mean with debating wise?
Yeah, actually, I have academic degree on marketing, but basically,
Okay.
I am right now working in IT field as a technical guy in system engineer. Actually, I, I work on Dell Technologies server in this area. Actually, that means by profession, I am a IT person,
Yeah,
but I have also a business degree on marketing.
yeah. And you are asking how you can use this workshop. Well, this workshop was mainly focused on people who are debating, and oftentimes in debates, in a lot of like big tournaments, you'll have motions about the EU, which can be, should the EU have a standing army? Do we think that the EU should have their currency split up between North and South? Um, should the EU take a specific stance against China? Should they put in more tariffs? Should they create euro bonds? All of these specific things are very relevant for debaters. If it comes to your question about how can I apply this for IT and marketing and economics and all that kind of stuff, I do not know what kind of company you would work for. I do think this might be a thing of partially interest, but also just grasping how the EU market works. So if you have some interaction with the EU, that you understand the nuances of the fact that there's a single market, but there's also a difference between the Eurozone. There's also a different actually a different nuance with like the free trade block that they have and all of that kind of stuff. But if you're asking about your specific job and all that kind of stuff, I would not know how to specifically link this workshop to it. It is mainly focused on debaters.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Actually, so is it possible actually to be connected with you over LinkedIn or any other platform?
Yeah, you can contact me on LinkedIn or Facebook. You can send me a message. That's
So
fine.
could you please share your LinkedIn profile ID so can we
Yeah,
can follow or
I'll do it via.
please share through the chat box your LinkedIn ID if you want. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I'll stop the recording now.